Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Tech Recruitment Podcast. I have a special guest here today. His name is Raphael Danilo, and he's the CEO of a platform called Jobs Tech. Jobs Tech focuses on interview intelligence, so gathering some intelligence from interviews with candidates. In this interview, we are going to talk about trends in interviewing candidates. We are going to talk about how will the interviews change after people go back to work from an office. And we will talk about how can we in recruitment organize interviews without biases. We will also talk about how can agencies, how can recruiters organize interviews faster and easier. So this is gonna be an awesome interview with Raphael Danilo from Jobs Tech. So Raphael, before we dive deeper to those recruitment trends, why don't you tell us a bit more about why did you actually start this company? Why are you building this platform?
Yeah, I think, I've been doing remote work for the better part of the last decade, long before COVID hit and kind of forced it all upon us. And one of the biggest challenges I had in, building remote teams and recruiting remote talent was around building the level of conviction within the team and the level of alignment within the recruiting team that's required in order to make such a big decision as recruiting someone when you never really meet them in person right up until that point. And so there's kind of like a light bulb in my head that went up, that we needed a better set of tools that were software driven, that would allow recruiting teams, including myself, to better capture the voice of the candidate and allow recruiting teams to really share that voice of the candidate internally in order to make higher conviction decisions faster. A lot of the challenges that we had weren't around scheduling interviews. We could do that with Calendly or tools like GoodTime. What we really struggled on was really being able to share that voice of the candidate, use those sort of like snippets of the answers, and really be able to have everyone kind of fall in love with that candidate without necessarily being a part of every single one of those conversations, because it wasn't as easy to set up as let's do an in-person interview where everybody can meet this person sort of naturally.
That's so cool. Now when you mention it, I just recall some of the moments when I was interviewing candidates, and then I wanted to share this with the hiring manager or even with some of my colleagues, and it's just so difficult to remember exactly what they said, and I'm trying to type really fast, but it's just different when you have some written notes and or quote that is or could be misinterpreted, and when you have something that you can just replay, and especially some simple quotes. So that's pretty cool.
It's not just here, the memory that we have of what happened during a Zoom call drops by about 60% within the first hour of that meeting ending, right? So when you think about using your best recollection or memory of what happened during a meeting, and maybe some scribbled notes on a Moleskine notepad, in
Mm.
order to sort of like share your insights or your feedback with the rest of your recruiting team, you're actually really working off of like 40% of what
Mm.
happened and what actually might have mattered.
Mm. And now when you mentioned, we are also on a Zoom call, so probably our listeners will only remember these 40 or 60%, maybe even even less, right? So it's quite frustrating, really, and especially if you think that someone's career may depend on what do we remember, right? So we in recruitment we decide on the candidate's career eventually, right? Because we either reject them or we put them forward in the process. So it's definitely good to have some tool in place that you can always go back to, and this is integrated with Zoom, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So we integrate directly with Zoom. We integrate directly with your calendar, so we can show you all of your upcoming events. As a recruiter, you can pick which ones you want to record and transcribe. So you don't necessarily want to record your internal one-on-one with your manager, but you want to make sure you just record the interviews. So we have deep connectors with Zoom, the calendar, as well as the applicant tracking system. So the
Mhm.
tool that most recruiting teams use to sort of manage their hiring process. could be Greenhouse, Lever. There's a bunch of tools that recruiting teams use. We build pretty deep integrators with those tools as well, so that if you schedule interviews from those tools, we make it easy to add jobs. But we also give you a space in the applicant tracking system to be able to easily go back to the recording and the transcript at any moment, right? And so we sort of build these deep connectors with your system of record, so this data doesn't just get lost, and you don't have to like go on the Zoom history settings and like look for a recording. Like it's all sort of like it lives where you spend your day-to-day hours as a recruiter.
Cool, awesome. So then, what if say a new recruiter joins the team? Like, what would you say? How the teams can actually use this intelligence eventually to onboard new joiners in the team? How they can get different recruiters up to speed?
Yeah, I think that's another really, really interesting use case that recording and transcribing interviews allows you to do sort of 10x better, is onboarding new interviewers and providing that continuous coaching. Now that you have recorded interviews, generally speaking, not 100% of interviews are great interviews, right? And so you'll have maybe 20-30% of those interviews that are good, and they might be for different roles, your technical roles, your go-to-market roles, your executive roles. And you'll want to sort of build a library of some of those best interviews, kind of building a library of your best customer calls, kind of similar, your best hiring conversations, and then provide those as a sort of like onboarding kit to new interviewers, so they can see what does good look like, right? But then the great thing about recording calls on a continuous basis is to enable that continuous improvement as well, which is really, really critical in order to keep the bar high for your recruiting organization. So what that looks like is, an interviewer will record their calls, and at any moment in time, they can go back and see how they did. What could they have done differently? Could they have asked better follow-up questions? Could they have engaged the candidate better to create a better candidate experience? And vice versa, they can watch their more senior colleagues' calls, with their consent, of course, in order for them to continuously sort of like improve and see how more senior interviewers are, might be doing things that are more effective. So basically, replicating wins, and at the same time continuously filling gaps where they might pop up.
And that's interesting, because really, especially now in IT recruitment, it's just so demanding. Like the whole market is so competitive, and recruiters need to be able to speak the tech language with candidates these days. And it's really hard to learn it just by watching some videos on YouTube, because it's quite disconnected. But this could be, as you say, quite interesting way how to get new candidates up to speed. Not candidates, but I mean recruiters, new colleagues. Do you, because you work with other recruitment teams, with agencies, you have clients. So do you have any other ideas how could they get their colleagues up to speed? Something that you've seen work quite well, something that you would recommend other staffing agencies or corporate recruiters?
I think one of the features that we've enabled, that has been really, really sort of like well received by recruiting teams that we work with, is the ability to timestamp moments of the interviews, right? So an interview conversation, there's a lot of fluff in there. There might be some small talk, not everything is interesting, from a coaching standpoint. And so you want to have the ability to sort of grab the snippets and create sort of like a highlight reel, that isn't 30 minutes long for every conversation. And so that's both useful for training and coaching. It's actually also helpful if you want to just share the snippets that are interesting to actually assess the candidate as a team. But so that ability to create snippets has been really, really highly sort of like well received. And actually with our Chrome extension, you can do that during the call, right? So as you're taking your notes, we provide you with like a Chrome extension sort of notepad. All of those notes can get synced and you can clean them up after. But actually, as you're taking those notes, it timestamps the meeting. So it knows at which point you're taking that note, during the meeting. So if the candidate is asking about compensation, you write a note, you can easily go back to that specific moment in the meeting later on. And it sounds like something simple, but it saves recruiting teams so much time in order to really get to value faster, because recruiting teams are busy, especially in the agency world. It's a game of speed, right? So that's really critical. Another thing that's really cool in the kind of agency world specifically, which is the world that you live in, is the ability to record those really like great candidate conversations where you're trying to pitch your client on that candidate. And it's really critical for that customer, for that client, to fall in love with that candidate. And that's difficult with just a resume or with just some notes from your call. But if you're able to grab those snippets and say, hey, look at how John or look at how Sally answered to this question about like why they're excited to work at your company, I thought that was such a great answer. Check it out. That allows you to very quickly communicate that passion, that energy that we as people need. And we're as recruiters, as interviewers, we're still human. We still need that sort of like human energy. And the ability to capture that voice is really powerful, especially if you can make it sort of succinct and easy to share with the snippets.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you say this, because in IT recruitment now it's a lot about sales. So we either sell to candidates the opening, or we sell candidates to hiring managers, and this could be quite an interesting way how to increase the perception that the candidate is great, just by sharing. How does it actually work now with the permission? Like, can we or under what circumstances can we share the recording actually with the hiring manager?
Yeah, as long as it's within the context of a recruitment process, that's effectively what the candidate is giving you permission to do. Is like, hey, you can record this conversation as long as it's being shared within the hiring team in order to make a decision. And generally speaking, by the way, going back a little bit to the coaching conversation, more senior recruiters are already sort of coming in and sitting in on calls with their more junior recruiters and interviewers in order to shadow them, right? It typically creates these kind of awkward three-way conversations where you have the recruiter, you have the candidate, and then you have like someone sitting in the background kind of taking notes, not speaking. So you're already sort of doing something that takes time, and isn't the best use of your senior team members, right? It creates awkwardness for both the candidate and the more junior recruiter. So being able to just record that conversation, even if it's just for those training and coaching purposes, ends up saving a lot of time also for the more senior folks, and ends up making your candidates more comfortable, right? And so actually, communicating that to the candidate ends up being a really great argument for why this matters, as well as just overall making the process more transparent and less biased. And it's very difficult to make a process less biased if there's no oversight into the conversations between candidates and recruiters. So what's been really interesting for us is candidates tend to, number one, barely notice. They're like, oh, this call is being recorded. Okay, most of my calls are recorded these days anyways, so it's almost like they don't notice. But when they do ask, they actually almost have a better opinion of the company, because they're like, okay, like they actually care about having a high bar for recruiting. They're not just randomly throwing recruiters on calls with candidates and telling them, try your best.
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool. It's just now when you mentioned the bias, this is probably also a good way how to sort of get rid of the bias. I mean, we probably cannot get rid of it at all, but if a recruiter knows that the call is being monitored, then the recruiter probably will be less likely to reject the candidate due to some bias, whether knowingly or not. So that's really an interesting way how to increase the quality of interviews, and eventually boost the staffing agencies recruitment team at all. Okay, cool. And I'm just thinking about some other challenges that you've seen on the market. Something related to IT recruitment, of course. This market is very dynamic, so of course recruiters struggle with actually some intelligence during the call as well, because they may need some help with what kind of questions to ask, or they may be interviewing a DevOps candidate and may not recall what actually to ask. Is there any way how they can get this kind of level of insights right away in real time during the call?
Yeah, one of the things that we do with the Chrome extension is we allow you to pull up your interview kits from your applicant tracking system directly during the call. Now, we only show you sort of like the summary. We try to make it not a distraction for the interview because you're imagining you're talking to a candidate, you have this kind of information on the side, you're taking notes. So it's I think we've done a good job of like sort of obsessing over that recruiter experience in order to ensure that there's not information overload while they're on the meeting and that the tool doesn't end up distracting them more than it's supposed to help them, right? So I think it's kind of like a very elegant UI for that. But yeah, basically being able to pull up even if it's just which competencies really matter for this engineering role that I might be hiring for, right? Or what are some of the cultural aspects that the company really wants to emphasize? So being able to pull those up, and then typically in an applicant tracking system, for example, like Greenhouse, you can create interview kits that also contain questions, like high signal questions, in order to measure those competencies. Like if I'm trying to assess teamwork, teamwork skills of a candidate, I might ask, tell me over time where you overcame a challenge with the team. So we will have those questions kind of populated on the side, so that if you're looking for a refresh on what a good question might be, you kind of have those on the side. So that can be really, really helpful to make sure that as a recruiter or interviewer, if you're just jumping from one interview to the next, you didn't have time to go into your ATS, download the interview kit, whatever, you can just easily kind of click it last minute on the fly, and it just kind of pops up.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly how I do it usually. I'm supposed to start an interview with the candidate, and then I'm just opening up the the CV while the candidate is preparing. But
Exactly.
I mean, you can do it after some practice. Of course, I wouldn't recommend it to junior IT recruiters, but that's where ideally in the ideal world the people would get right with some seniority. They just have some tool, they have the knowledge, they have the experience, and they don't have to prepare for half an hour for an interview. They just hop on it, they see the questions, they ask. But then if we just extrapolate all these super exciting trends and new technologies, like where do you see this heading? Because you sort of prepare this tool for recruiters to ask great questions. It is recorded, but then isn't the next step just to remove the human person, the human resource, out of this equation and just leave it somehow? What are some other tools out there that use some artificial intelligence, and you don't have to name them,
Mm.
but just like where do you see this heading? Like what are the trends if we extrapolate that?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really good question. Is the use of artificial intelligence and technology going to take over the actual assessment of the candidate, or is it only going to support the sort of like human recruiters? I think we are more focused on automating really redundant tasks, which are more like admin, back office, like, things like pulling up the interview kit so you don't have to log into your ETS download, like little things like that, transcribing your call so that you don't need to take frantic notes and you can actually focus on the conversation. Things like this that are basically like 99% accurate and foolproof. And, will things that you can count on. The thing with using artificial intelligence to assess a candidate, like, I don't know, actually doing an analysis of the candidate's, I don't know, voice or facial expressions, is it is not reliable, number one, as of today. And number two, it brings up so many questions of biases. What data set was this AI trained on? What features is the AI looking for? Like if it's facial expressions, what do you do if someone has disabilities? Is the AI able to deal with like these sort of atypical profiles that might not fit the kind of typical data point, so to speak, candidate that you had in your sort of algorithm training data set. So if you kind of go down that rabbit hole, you realize that there's so many. It's a Pandora's box. Like there's
Mhm.
so many potential issues that kind of pop up with this. So frankly, we don't believe that AI should assess the candidate. We believe in building tools for recruiting teams to be more effective. And I think where natural language processing can be powerful is in actually looking at transcripts of those conversations, like in aggregate, and allowing recruiting teams to sort of like look through all of those transcripts and look for patterns. For example, if you sort of filter all of your calls, all of your interviews by gender, do we treat female candidates versus male candidates versus non-binary candidates differently, right? Are we talking more? Are we using different type of language? Like are we treating candidates differently? This is a very tough conversation, a very sort of like tough thing to think about, but it's really critical. And currently there's absolutely no way of knowing unless there's sort of like a way to search across all of those kind of conversations at a sort of macro level. And I think giving the tools to recruiting teams, and in this case people leaders, to sort of look at those patterns, I think is ultimately going to be a lot more powerful than trying to automate the human with some AI that ultimately is a little bit of a black box.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Interesting that you mentioned it also with this bias, because whether it's AI or a human, like there is some bias, right? In any
Yep.
case. So it's not about removing it completely, but probably just decreasing the bias. And even if, I mean, with AI, it's sort of easy to blame, as you say, right? Like the AI could have bias, but people have, and then just the question is whose bias is stronger or influences the decision more. So I mean, we all try to avoid biases, but it is what it is, unfortunately. And also interesting that you mentioned the data. So I'm just wondering, what else can recruitment teams pull from the data sets? Like once they see what candidates and the recruiters talk about, what kind of intelligence can they gather from these transcripts?
Yeah. So like recruiting is fundamentally human, by the way. So I think another aspect is ultimately candidates need to be sold on roles, right? So I think that also is another area where AI is going to really struggle. And that brings me to the point of candidate engagement, which we are able to track a couple of metrics around sort of like engagement, and how engaged both the interviewer and the candidate are. So we're able to sort of like surface up some insights that are pretty helpful for people leaders to see, like which of my candidates are getting more engaged, which of my interviewers do a better job at doing this, so that then you can go into the why, right? And ultimately that's the data, the metrics are always just kind of like high level, but if you want to kind of understand the why, it's always case by case specific, right? And so that's where you'll actually start diving into a couple of the conversations, a couple of the highlights of the conversations of those interviewers that might be doing a really great job versus other interviews that might not be doing a great job. So for example, if a certain interviewer tends to score candidates differently than the rest of the recruiting team, or tends to not do a great job at getting responses from those candidates after they've done an interview. Basically, if there's any level of drop off or bias in sort of the way that they assess candidates, you can actually drill down into the conversations and really understand better, like, is there a coachable moment here? Is there an opportunity for coaching or feedback, or just maybe this recruiter is actually doing something really great that the rest of the team hasn't grasped yet, and so being able to kind of drill down into that, so that again you can replicate wins where they are, but you can also identify coachable moments where they might be. And I think the best way to use that conversational data is in tandem with the rest of your hiring data, right? So whether it's like pipeline velocity, are offers getting accepted? Are candidates moving through the process or not? Are they dropping off? Are they even turning down offers? And then if you want to understand why, typically you have to go back to those conversations, and now you can in just one click.
Mm. By the way, I like this phrase, "coachable moments." That's so interesting to put it this way. I guess I'll start using it with the team, with the team as well. Guys, are there any coachable moments?
Yeah.
That's very cool, very cool. Okay, we can probably also look at, for example, what happened before some date or after some date, right? If there is
Yep.
someone new who starts, or I don't know, if there is new joiners, or what happened with certain candidates. Or actually one other case that just popped in my mind. We had one client who we weren't really able to supply with great candidates because either the salary was not up to their expectations or the candidates were just not a good fit. So, in other words, only two junior candidates applied, and those senior candidates were not interested because of the salary offered. And then after a month or two, they asked us what was the salary these people were actually asking for, and we didn't really have it captured anywhere. So maybe this kind of insight would also be good to somehow get from those recordings if it was able to somehow search in some, I don't know, structured way, or somehow to pull it from those
Exactly.
transcripts.
Yeah, you can do a simple keyword search or topic based search, and then you can filter it by time. You can filter it by who the interviewer was, or you can filter it by who the candidate was. So that really allows you to sort of like really drill down at a granular level to do exactly these types of analyses, which are very case by case specific, right? Like that's a use case that you had for that role. Another team might have a use case of, hey, there's this candidate we really like. We're hesitating between candidate A and candidate B. We need to kind of go back to the initial conversation we had with them like a month ago or 3 weeks ago, which is not even yesterday, where we still have 40% of memory. It's a month ago, we probably have 5% memory. How can we pull up highlights of that conversation to remember some of the important points that they might have brought up? And now you can do that really easily. So that might be great for like an internal hiring team that is hesitating between two candidates. So you have so many of these use cases that kind of pop up. And we're continuing to sort of like build more and more sort of specific tools to support those different use cases. But at a high level, I think just that ability to sort of like search through all of those conversations is has so many sort of like opportunities to make the recruiting process better and ultimately candidates happier.
Hmm. And possibly even to make those interviews faster. Now I'm just thinking about another use case when, for example, while working remotely, we have little visibility to how long these interviews actually are with some of our colleagues. But if there was a way how to see the length somehow, then we could probably see some patterns. Like one person takes 45 minutes, the other only 20, and the submission rate or the hiring rate is the same. So yeah, it's really interesting. Now when we discuss it, I'm just wondering like how come, like if you compare where the recruitment was 5 years or 10 years ago, it was just so inefficient, right? People were still meeting at the office. They were they were just visiting hiring managers in an office on site, which took time. They had to travel, commute. They had to spend 1 hour on an interview, and now it's just so much faster, easier. Hop on a Zoom call, so it increases the efficiency, and it's interesting. But now, just thinking about people going back to the offices, how do they use this kind of a tool when they are meeting in person?
Yeah. It's something that we think about a lot. We have a lot of those conversations with our customers who some of which are going back to the office, some of which are maybe testing hybrid, some of which are going to stay full remote for the next few years. I think what's really interesting, especially for the customers that are going back into the office, is what does my hiring process look like now that I'm going back into the office? And I think the consensus that we've seen from our customers who are going back into the office is that the top of the funnel, so the first steps of the hiring process, still are significantly more efficient, but also higher signal when they are conducted, effectively over Zoom, right? So maybe the first call, maybe a large part of the interview loop, and you actually only bring in the top candidates in person for that sort of on stage. So once you're back into the office, especially if you're looking at local candidates, the on stage being in person, being sort of IRL, that has a lot of power because you're also able to sell the candidate a lot more. They're able to see the office. You're able to also get a sort of good sort of like you have a good relationship building opportunity there as well, both for them to get excited, for you to get excited. But when it comes to very quickly gathering signals from a candidate. And in any hiring process, you might interview 5, 10, 15 candidates, and you might get dozens of applications. The recruiting process is a game of sort of like speed and signal gathering, right? And so you need to be able to sort of very quickly make a decision on who do I move forward with in this process and who do I not, because you don't have the opportunity to bring in 50 candidates for an on-site for every role, right? And so it's about what is more efficient. And frankly, yeah, jumping on a Zoom call is a lot more efficient than scheduling it in person with a bunch of folks IRL. And what's interesting is Zoom conversations are naturally more structured than in-person conversations. So when you're in person, maybe the person's late or maybe you're late, you're going to talk about, the weather, or how did you get here? Did you like this place? Like, what do you think about the office? Let me show you around. Like, so you have all of this kind of fluff, which if you're already, kind of sold, okay, this is probably a candidate we want to move forward with, it's an on-site, that's a great thing to do, right? Building that rapport. But it's very difficult to do that with every single candidate, at the top of the funnel. And so a Zoom conversation, interestingly enough, allows you to have a sort of like a lot more structured of a conversation and allows you to make those faster decisions, which is really, really critical for hiring. Like, time to hire is not just an efficiency metric. In the current market that's so competitive to find great talent, it's also one of the biggest drivers of, are you going to be able to bring top talent on board? If your hiring process takes too long or is too slow, you're going to miss out on the best talent. And so you got to make sure that top of the funnel is both efficient and high signal. And so I think for that reason, we're not going to see the best recruiting teams adopt sort of like in-person interviews for the first kind of steps of the process.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. There is a lot of candidates who are not a good fit sort of right away, and you can just see it on a CV. With some, it's like maybe. So you organize the quick call, but it, as you say, it would be heavily inefficient to hop or organize an in-person meeting with those candidates. So interesting. Okay. So now we see where this industry is heading, and as you say, even with people going back to the office, it's quite unlikely that they will start scheduling the first interviews at the top of the funnel with in-person candidates. Okay, are there any other trends that you've noticed while working with other staffing agencies or corporate recruiters? Something that you would like to advise fellow recruiters to check or to focus on in the next few months?
I think one of the big trends that we're seeing is companies are investing more and more in interviewer coaching and training. And I think companies understand that you have to go further than just, a 1-day seminar or 2-hour seminar on the first day and then just call it a day and say, okay, this person is trained, So I think this kind of like idea of continuous learning, continuous coaching, especially if you can do it yourself by recording and looking at your own calls, I think that's something that a lot of interviews and recruiters are already doing on their own, kind of like, as you mentioned, your own experience. And I think having a purpose-built tool for recruitment that records those conversations, but also connects with your applicant tracking systems, provides you the right insights at the right time. I think that's going to be something that's here to stay. And I think companies are also looking for better tools to identify and eradicate bias, across the process. And so we've seen great companies like Textio do work at the job description level, at the very, very top of the funnel, making sure that there's no biased language in the job description that's gonna say like, oh, we're only hiring rock star ninjas, which is only going to attract a specific type of candidate. And I think that's a great first step in the right direction. But unfortunately, a lot of the bias in the recruitment process happens during the interview process. Like, that is the element that is, both the toughest, but also the most important to get right. Ultimately, hiring decisions are just driven by conversations between candidates and recruiters. And so ensuring that those conversations are of the highest quality and are efficient is something that recruiting teams, across staffing, high volume, all the way to like executive search, are looking to get right. And they just care more about one KPI or the other, whether it's quality or whether it's velocity. And so I think those are the trends that we're going to keep seeing is what are the tools that allow you to capture that bias, eradicate it at the same time as just making the process more efficient, more effective. And interestingly, those things play hand in hand, because if you have a less biased process, you're going to make better, more objective hiring decisions.
Mm. Awesome, awesome. Well, this is great that you mentioned it. It's something to keep in mind. Even for me personally, I mean, I try to avoid any kind of bias, but it's just sometimes there, right? And it requires some conscious effort to not be biased, which I mean, it's so unfortunate, but yeah, it's even better to have some tool that keep you, reminded that this is how it should be done, and just do it properly that way. So very cool, very cool. Okay, cool. Where can actually recruiters get to know more about the tool or about yourself? Or what kind of website can they visit?
Yeah, so you can head over to yobstech.com. So that's yobstech.com. Feel free to book a demo, or you can even try the tool for free for 14 days. I think we may even have a special deal with you guys that we can share a little bit more about. And you can also reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm at Raphael Danilo.
Awesome, awesome, cool. So I'll add these links in the comments on YouTube or in the podcast show notes, so people can link and connect with you if they have any questions or they would like to learn more about the tool that you are building. So definitely cool, cool. All right. So yeah, thanks a lot for sharing all these insights and the trends in recruitment, IT recruitment, and also a general recruitment. So thanks for joining, and we'll keep in touch.
Thanks, man. This was fun.